They met in person before the battle. Two generals who'd shaped the fate of the Mediterranean world, standing face to face on neutral ground between their armies. What they said in that meeting, history will never know completely. But the next day, one would prove that he'd surpassed his teacher, and the legend of invincibility would die on that field. October 202 BC. Near the town of Zama in modern-day Tunisia, two armies prepared for battle. But first, something extraordinary happened. Hannibal requested a personal meeting with Scipio. The two greatest generals of their age, enemies who'd never faced each other directly, would speak alone before their armies collided. Ancient sources claim they met on horseback between the battle lines, each accompanied only by interpreters. Hannibal was 45, weathered by nearly 2 decades of continuous warfare. Scipio was 33 in his absolute prime. What was said? The accounts vary wildly. Some claim Hannibal offered peace terms, acknowledge Carthaginian equality, establish fair boundaries, end the bloodshed. Others say Scipio demanded total surrender. Some sources suggest they simply took each other's measure, understanding that words wouldn't resolve what only battle could decide. What seems most likely is this: two men who dedicated their lives to destroying each other's nations stood together for a brief moment, recognizing in each other something their own countrymen couldn't understand: the weight of command, the burden of genius, the loneliness of being the one person everyone depends on. Then they returned to their armies and prepared to fight. One of them would leave that field victorious. The other's legend of invincibility would be shattered forever. Hannibal commanded approximately 40,000 infantry and 4,000 cavalry. His army was a patchwork reflecting 15 years of war and recall from Italy. In the front ranks, recently recruited Carthaginian citizens and Libyan levies, men with minimal training, adequate equipment, but no combat experience against Roman legions. Behind them, more experienced Carthaginian and Libyan troops, better trained but still not veterans. In the rear, held in reserve, his Italian veterans, perhaps 8,000 men who'd survived 15 years of campaigning, who'd fought at Cannae and Trebia, who'd followed him across the Alps. These veterans were Hannibal's ace. Disciplined, experienced, absolutely loyal. He was saving them for the decisive moment. He also had 80 war elephants, Carthage's traditional shock weapon, meant to break Roman formations before the infantry engaged. But his cavalry was weak. Only Numidian light horsemen, and even those lacked enthusiasm. The best Numidian warriors were fighting for Scipio now, under King Massinissa. Scipio commanded similar infantry numbers, Roman legions and Italian allies, perhaps 35 to 40,000 men. They were fresh, well-supplied, and led by officers who'd won consistently in Spain. But Scipio's decisive advantage was cavalry. Massinissa had brought thousands of elite Numidian horsemen, the same cavalry that had won battles for Hannibal for 15 years. Combined with Roman and Italian cavalry, Scipio commanded perhaps 6,000 mounted troops against Hannibal's 4,000. If you're on the edge of your seat wondering how this clash of titans unfolds, hit that subscribe button now. Because what happens in the next hour will determine who history remembers as the greatest general of the ancient world. Hannibal deployed his forces in 3 distinct lines, unusual for ancient warfare where armies typically fought in a single, cohesive formation. First line, the 80 elephants, meant to shatter Roman cohesion before the infantry even engaged. Behind the elephants, his rawest troops, expendable forces whose job was to absorb the initial Roman assault and tire them out. Second line, more experienced Carthaginian troops, positioned to finish what the first line started. Third line, his Italian veterans held far back as a strategic reserve. These men would strike at the perfect moment to break the Romans when they were exhausted and disorganized. On his flanks, his weak cavalry would try to delay Scipio's superior horsemen long enough for the infantry plan to work. It was complex. It was clever. It was the plan of a general who knew he was outmatched in cavalry and needed his infantry to win the battle before the mounted forces could decide it. The problem was, Scipio had studied Hannibal for 15 years, and he knew what was coming. Scipio arranged his legions differently than traditional Roman formation. Instead of the usual dense blocks, he created clear lanes between his maniples, the small unit formations that made up a legion. Why? Because Scipio had studied how elephants fought. They were terrifying but vulnerable to disciplined troops who didn't panic. And elephants, when charging, would naturally move through open spaces rather than crashing into dense formations. When the elephants charged, Scipio's legions would open the lanes wider. The elephants would run through harmlessly while Roman infantry attacked them from the sides with javelins and spears. His cavalry had simple orders: win your engagements as quickly as possible, then wheel around and attack Hannibal's infantry from behind. It was Canny's tactic, the double envelopment that had destroyed 70,000 Romans 24 years ago. Scipio was going to beat Hannibal using Hannibal's own masterpiece. The elephants charged first. 80 massive animals thundering toward Roman lines, meant to create chaos and terror. Scipio's trumpeters and hornblowers created a deafening noise. Elephants, sensitive to sound, panicked. Some charged forward into the prepared lanes where Roman soldiers jabbed at their vulnerable spots: legs, eyes, trunks. Others turned and stampeded back through Hannibal's own lines, trampling Carthaginian soldiers. The elephant charge, meant to shatter Roman formations, failed completely. Worse, it disrupted Hannibal's own cavalry on the flanks. The cavalry engagements began. Scipio's superior numbers and better motivated horsemen drove off Hannibal's cavalry quickly. But here's where discipline mattered. Instead of pursuing defeated enemies for easy kills, Scipio's cavalry maintained formation and began their wheel around the battlefield. Hannibal's first line of infantry advanced and collided with Roman legions. The fighting was brutal, hand-to-hand combat with swords and spears. The Carthaginian first line fought hard but was pushed back by Roman pressure and superior training. Here's where Hannibal's plan should have worked. His second line was supposed to support the first, creating continuous resistance that would exhaust the Romans. But something went wrong. The second line refused to let the retreating first line pass through their formation. They saw beaten, fleeing soldiers and didn't want them disrupting their ranks. The first line, trapped between advancing Romans and their own second line, was slaughtered. Hannibal's second line then engaged the Romans. Fresh troops against somewhat tired legionaries. The fighting was even more intense. Roman discipline against Carthaginian desperation. It was close. It was bloody. And then Hannibal's third line, his Italian veterans, finally moved forward. This is what Hannibal had been saving them for. 8,000 veterans who'd fought in Italy for 15 years, who'd won at Cannae and Trebia and Trasimene, who knew Roman tactics and how to beat them. They crashed into the engaged Roman formations like a hammer. The Romans, already tired from fighting through two lines, suddenly faced Hannibal's best troops at their most vulnerable moment. The battle hung in balance. Both sides were committed. Both were exhausted. This was the moment that would decide everything. And then Scipio's cavalry completed their maneuver. They struck Hannibal's infantry from behind, the exact move Hannibal had used at Cannae. The same tactic. The same devastating effect. Hannibal's veterans, fighting magnificently against Roman legions in front of them, suddenly had cavalry attacking from the rear. They were surrounded, compressed, trapped in a killing zone with enemies on all sides. Exactly what Hannibal had done to the Romans at Cannae. The Carthaginian lines buckled. Units tried to turn and face the new threat, breaking formation. The Romans in front pressed harder. The cavalry struck from behind. Hannibal's veterans fought desperately. These were men who'd survived impossible odds before, who'd followed Hannibal for 15 years. But they were outnumbered, surrounded, and attacked from multiple directions. The formation collapsed. Some units fought to the death. Others tried to break out and were cut down. A few thousand surrendered when continued resistance became suicide. Hannibal, watching his army disintegrate, made the hardest decision of his life. He could stay and die with his men, a glorious end to a legendary career. Or he could escape and live to fight another day. He escaped with a handful of cavalry, riding through the carnage of his destroyed army. For the first time in his career, Hannibal had lost a battle he personally commanded. By sunset, 20,000 Carthaginians were dead, 20,000 more captured. The rest scattered or fled. Hannibal's army, the force he'd brought back from Italy and reinforced in Africa, had been annihilated. Scipio's casualties were perhaps 1,500 men, a fraction of what he'd inflicted. It wasn't just a victory, it was a demonstration. Scipio had fought Hannibal using Hannibal's own tactics and proven that he'd mastered them more completely than the master himself. The double envelopment that had destroyed Rome at Cannae had destroyed Carthage at Zama. The student had surpassed the teacher. And everyone who witnessed it understood, the age of Hannibal's dominance was over. After Zama, Carthage sued for peace. The terms Rome offered were harsh. Surrender all territories outside Africa, hand over the entire fleet except 10 ships, pay massive tribute for 50 years, never wage war without Roman permission. Carthage's Senate debated. Some wanted to continue fighting. Others argued the terms were impossible to accept. Hannibal, now leading Carthage's government, gave the deciding speech. According to sources, he told the Senate, "Accept the terms. We have lost. Continuing will only make our destruction complete. Someone in the Senate, still not understanding the magnitude of defeat, argued that the terms were too harsh. Hannibal reportedly laughed, bitter, exhausted laughter, and said, "You don't understand. We should have made peace after Cannae when we had leverage. We continued fighting and threw away every advantage. Now we take what we can get and survive. That is victory enough." The Senate voted to accept Rome's terms. The Second Punic War was over. Carthage had lost. Rome had won. And Scipio Africanus as he would be called, the first Roman general to earn a cognomen from the territory he'd conquered, had accomplished what no other Roman had managed. He'd defeated Hannibal in open battle. But was it over for Hannibal? He'd lost the war, but he was only 45 years old. Carthage was humiliated but not destroyed. He could rebuild. He could govern. He could live peacefully in the city he'd fought his entire life to protect. Except Rome wouldn't let him. They remembered Cannae. They remembered Trebia and Trasimene and 15 years of terror. They remembered 70,000 dead in a single afternoon. Rome would never forget. And they would never forgive. What came next was 20 years of exile, of running, of desperate attempts to fight Rome through other kingdoms. Hannibal's war was over. But his flight from Rome's vengeance, and the final tragic act of his life, was just beginning.